Hi, and welcome to the first edition of Cartooning Classes Online. If you're one of my current or former students, welcome. If you're new and you just stumbled across this channel, welcome as well. I hope these are informative for you as well. But these classes are primarily intended for my current and former cartooning students, as we're going to be expanding upon some of the lessons that we've gone over in class. And hopefully, for those of you that are just jumping into this, these are going to be helpful for you guys as well. Um, Today, I thought we could go over the piece that I'm currently working on, which is the one you're looking at right now. I could take you guys through my process a little bit. We could talk about digital art a little bit today, and then also just an overview of what we can do in the future. So I thought this would be a good piece to start with. It's not finished. It's very much in progress, but it's far enough along where we can talk about, my process and the tools that I'm using and how these things translate from traditional to digital. So let me go ahead and turn off all the layers so you guys can just see the sketch. Okay, so here's our sketch. I did them as two separate layers and then merged them, so that's why the background is going through the figure, but it didn't ultimately matter because I knew I was going to trace over them anyway to ink them and color them, so I didn't need the sketch to be perfect like that. But I did take the background and the figure and I merged them together to create this layer that I use as my sketch. And as you can see, I wanted the figure to be making eye contact with the viewer, which those of you that are my current and former students, we talk a lot about drawing your characters in 3/4 so that they're never making direct eye contact with the camera unless you want them to. And this is yet another example of what I'm always talking about, which is the first lesson for today, which is that all of these rules that we're going to go over today are meant to be bent and broken. There are always exceptions for when these rules may or may not apply, right? So depending on your situation, there's going to be situations where, well, depending on your circumstances, there's going to be situations where this might call for you to follow the rule, or the situation might call for you to disregard it entirely. So for this one, I'm playing around with this idea that the viewer is looking directly at the figure, and the figure is looking directly at the viewer, so there's just direct eye contact that I wanted. But then I've also got the vanishing point kind of going through the figure, going past the figure, through the figure. So this idea that these buildings are kind of pointing like an arrow at the figure, almost at the figure's face, kind of at his mouth where the mask is. So if you look at that, I set up my composition so that the perspective point was leading the eye of the viewer towards the figure. Does that make sense? If I grab my cursor, I can show you. So if we follow the line here, hopefully you guys can see my cursor here, but if we follow the line down, the end from the sidewalk too, they're taking us towards the figure. Now, I didn't want it to be going straight to the figure and stopping. I wanted to keep the eye gliding across the paper. So instead of having the vanishing point end inside the figure, I continued it out a little bit. And also that way you still see the road a little bit past him. So just a little tip here, you guys can use your composition to guide the viewer's eye in whichever direction you want it to go. And especially when you're setting up your comics and your panels, you're going to have to think about how the reader is going to progress across the page, right? So they're going to go from left to right, up to down. And as their eye is flowing across the page, you can kind of guide them in different angles, right? You can take them up and down and over and around and back over. So it's up to you what direction you want the viewer's eye to be going in, but be conscious of it when you're laying out your compositions. And your compositions are the layout of the elements of the page. So you've got your figure or multiple figures, your background, and your background can include a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, which we can talk about at another point. But then you want to think about any text that you're going to have on the page, whether it's narration blocks or thought bubbles, word bubbles. So if you want to incorporate any of that in, you've got to think about where it's going to fit. And so for me, I was thinking about having some sort of narration box, possibly, or some kind of text with this. I was actually thinking about this as a comic book page, and there's other panels. I just decided to isolate this one and try and do them each individually, kind of thinking about them each as individual pieces, and then trying to fit them together later, which isn't necessarily how everybody does things, but for this one, it's just how I wanted to try it out. So as I'm doing that, I'm thinking about how I'm going to place things, leaving enough room for things. So I've got this space up in the sky here, which is just empty right now. It just looks like empty space right now. But I could fill it with something later. Or I can use part of these buildings and still have enough of the building showing where it's going to be very clear to the reader what's happening in the background. So it might look like there's not a ton of space here, but I've still consciously left myself a few spots where I can go back in and add more elements if I want to. So you want to keep that in mind when you're laying stuff out, especially if you're doing a comic. You want to make sure you have enough room for all the words. I recommend using as few words as possible, but you're still going to have to put some words in there, and you want to make sure you have enough room for them. And you want to make sure that you're planning that out early on in the initial phase. So you can't see the words yet, but you can take my word for it that I've left some room in here to make sure that they fit. Okay, so once you get your sketch layer done, well, okay, let's talk about your sketch for a second, because this brings up another important point. Your first lines in your drawing should not be your final lines. And I see a lot of students, especially early on, start a drawing and put final lines down as their initial lines. And every mark they put down is a final mark. And that's not necessarily how everybody draws. In fact, most professional artists don't draw that way. Some do. Some totally do. And they're like magicians. And every mark they put down is a final mark. And by the time they're done, everything they've done is on the paper and it's amazing. But for most of us, we're doing a lot of searching to figure out what the right lines are and editing along the way. So we want to keep our lines very light so that we can always erase them. And we can always darken up whatever we're going to use as our final lines. So try and press as light as you can when you're working so that you can ultimately go back in and edit them if you need to. And also try and think about the shapes that you can use to build these objects up so that you're creating more forms, three-dimensional forms with volume than just focusing on the lines. Okay, so what we're ultimately trying to do here is to create the illusion of a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane. And for those of you that haven't had geometry yet, let me try and break this down a little more simply for you. We're trying to make it look like there's depth on the page, like it's a window and there's stuff inside of it, right? So when we're drawing, we want, even though we're working on a two-dimensional surface that has no depth to it, everything that we're doing is to give the illusion that there is space there. So if you look at what I did here, I made the figure really large in the panel. So he gets cut off at the chest and at the elbow, right? He doesn't quite fit in this panel, which means he's very close to us. I've pushed him forward. And the buildings, you can actually see the top and the bottom of some of these buildings, which means that they're further away because we're only seeing, less than half of this guy, but we're seeing all of these buildings. So therefore, he has to be a lot closer to us in these buildings, so these buildings are actually a lot bigger than he is. So that creates this illusion of depth. I've created this perspective where this guy is scaled so much larger than this building, or take this light pole, for instance, right here. This whole light pole here is about the size of his head, right? So the only way that that works is if he's much closer to us than the light pole is. So that illusion of depth is what you want to try and create in each one of your panels for your comics. And when you're starting off a comic, it's really nice to include the setting in the panel. Sometimes it's just the setting by itself so that you're letting your reader know where the story is taking place. If you just drop them into the story without letting them know where and when the story is, they might be confused. And sometimes, like I said, you can bend and break these rules, and you might have a situation where you really want the reader to be confused. You know, maybe it's a war zone and there's bombs going off all around and lights are flashing and it's dark and the character is very confused. So you want the reader to be just as confused as the character is. That is totally fine. But for the most part, you're going to want to include some kind of setting to let your viewer know when and where the story takes place. If you guys have watched any sitcoms, pretty much every scene of every sitcom starts with the outside of a building, usually a house. If you guys have watched Full House, like the original I haven't watched Fuller House, so I don't know how that is, but the original Full House, they always showed that house in San Francisco. And every time they showed a scene inside the house, they would show you the outside of the house. And all of the scenes were filmed on a soundstage, and they never were actually inside that house. But everybody felt like it was inside that house because the first thing you saw was the outside of the house to let you know where the story was taking place. So do the same thing with your panels. Lay out the first panel as the setting of your story to let your reader know where they are. And every time you change the setting, you should usually, give a panel for the setting to make sure the reader knows that we're somewhere new. Okay? Or at least that we're going back somewhere that we've been before. So once you finish with the sketch layer, then you want to start doing your line work, right? Your inks. So for that, this time your mark should be final, right? In your sketch layer, you can be a little bit more sketchy, for lack of a better term, right? So you can go over the lines multiple times if you want to. Try and do them all in one stroke if you can, but sometimes you have to feel it out as you're going, and I totally understand that. So you might have some extra lines, like if I zoomed in here, you can see the sketch lines here on the arm, especially on the mask here, because the mask was a later addition. I drew the face first and then added the mask. So you can see there was a lot of decision making going on here as I was figuring out how it was going to fit around the face. So that's all stuff you do in the sketch phase. Make sure you get everything figured out to the point where it makes sense to you. And then once you have all the information you need, you can move on. I do recommend giving yourself the minimal amount of visual information here, because you want to save as much time as you can for the line work and the coloring, and if you're going to add text, all the other steps that go into it. By giving yourself the minimal amount of information here, you're saving yourself time for those other steps, and those other steps are going to be more noticeable to the reader, so you want to spend more time on the stuff they're actually going to see. But having a really solid sketch is going to make sure you end up with a really solid finished piece of art, right? So you want to make sure the sketch is really solid before you move on. You don't want to shortcut it either. Okay? So once you get the sketch done, then you're going to do your line work on top of it. So I did these in two separate layers. Here's the background. Okay? And then, actually, let's just talk about the background first, because the figure is still transparent. So turn that off. Okay. So here you can see the line work. I like this example because the inks for the line work and the inks for the figure are very different. The inks for the buildings here are very geometric. It's a lot of straight lines and geometric shapes that ultimately come into perspective, and like I said, they come down to a vanishing point. So it's a lot of squares, it's a lot of triangles, it's a lot of rectangles, right? Not a lot of circles, but for the most part, like there's a diamond right here. It's just a lot of shapes and a lot of lines. It's very straight, it's very rigid, it's almost mechanical, right? So this is the man-made side of things, where everything's done with a ruler and a compass and all that, and everything is very structured, right? Whereas the figure, if I go ahead and switch that on now, the figure is very organic, right? So all of the lines here are curves, the shapes are more ovals or circles, all of the shapes have some kind of, all the lines have some kind of bend to them, and then, excuse me, and then you can see how that contrasts the buildings here. The other thing is, since the figure is so much closer to us and so much bigger than the buildings are, I put a thicker outline around the very edge of the figure, everywhere that the figure touches the background, right? So on the inside, where the figure is touching other parts of the figure, I don't have any, I have the same line quality, the same line thickness, right? But then on the outside, I went and just thickened up everywhere where the figure touches the background. And that helps pop it off of the background a little bit more and helps it stand out. It also helps make it appear closer to you, because if this were real life, I mean, granted, there wouldn't be an outline around the figure, but if there was, it would be larger, thicker, closest to you, and then it would be thinner, further away from you, if the same outline were, appearing to you closer and further away. So because of that, I made the character a little bit thicker as far as the outline goes, and then eventually that helps pop it off of the background a little bit more. Contrast helps things appear more in the foreground, closer to you, and things that have less contrast are going to appear to recede into the background. Okay? The other thing that creates the illusion of depth is that your highlights, your lighter colors, your lighter tones, they're going to pull forward and they're going to come forward, and then your shadows, your shading, is going to push back, right? So by using your lightest light and your darkest dark, you're going to create more, the illusion of more space between the two. And so if your drawings are looking flat when you're coloring them and shading them, think about the values that you're using, because by creating a lightest light, you're going to push those values forward, and by creating a darkest dark, you're going to push those values back. And that's going to create this illusion of depth. Okay, so if they're looking a little flat, keep that in mind. Think about how far the darks are receding. Think about how forward the values are coming. And it doesn't necessarily apply on the ink layer, but something to think about as we move forward. You want to think about how you're pulling things forward and pushing things back, right? So another aspect of that is the figure here is facing us. It's not in perspective at all, right? We're looking at it very flatly. So because of that, it contrasts the perspective here of the buildings, because they are receding into the background as they go back, right? So this building here is bigger because you can see how we can't see the top of the building or the bottom of the sidewalk over here. So that height compared to the smaller height here of the last building, it creates another illusion of depth, right? So keep the things that are closer to you bigger, and the things that are further away smaller, and then have the things that are closer overlapping the things that are further away too. Okay, these are all examples of what's called atmospheric perspective. So there's perspective, which is where you draw with a ruler to a vanishing point on the horizon. And then there's atmospheric perspective, which you don't use any vanishing points, you don't use any rulers, but you use different visual cues to let the viewer know that these things are closer or further away. Okay, so with that said, let's move on. Let me throw in the color layers now. Okay, so working digitally, the next step would be to do the flat colors. So these are just flat areas of color that sit underneath the ink layers, so that the black lines are on top. So you can draw underneath the black lines and they're going to cover that up. So at this step, it's very flat. It's very two-dimensional because, like I said, there's no value to create that illusion of depth from lights to darks. So once you finish with this step, then you have to start adding your shading and your highlights. And I haven't got to the highlights stage yet, but I can show you guys the shading in a second, at least for the figure, not for the background yet. So as you can see, I tried to pick colors that all kind of fit together, right? So I started with the building, and I used what colors were in the reference photo that I was looking at, right? And it was a lot of brick buildings, and I noticed that some of the brick buildings were brown, and some of the brick buildings were more red, and then they had a couple of these kind of stucco painted white walled buildings. So not a lot of color there, but they had these accents that were kind of this dark rose color, for lack of a better term. And then these green accents actually carried through the entire city. I'm not sure exactly why, per se. Maybe they were trying to create a sense of like more nature, because they didn't have a ton of trees there or something. But there was a lot of this green too. So taking those colors into consideration when I went to color this guy in, I kept the blue from the sky and I just made it a little more saturated. And then for the t-shirt, I picked reddish brown and made it a little bit darker than any of the buildings so that it wouldn't feel like it was fading into the buildings, and it would feel like it was standing out a little bit more. So even though it's a darker color, which would normally push into the background, uh, because it contrasts with the colors of the buildings themselves, it's helping it stand out from the buildings. If it was the same brown as these buildings here, you would possibly confuse part of the t-shirt for part of the buildings or vice versa. So I wanted to make sure that it was still a unique color, but fit in with the rest of the palette. Okay. And then for the hair and the skin tone, I just picked generic colors, but tried to keep them within the same general color scheme so that everything felt like it existed within the same world. If I had something here that was neon green, or if I had something here that was hot pink, it's going to feel like it doesn't fit. And that could be nice if you're trying to create a sense of contrast. Like if I had a pink bunny somewhere in here, it would stick out like a sore thumb. And if you have a pink bunny in here, you want it to stick out like a sore thumb, right? So the contrast would draw the reader's eye to it, but it would feel like it was somehow disconnected from the rest of the piece. So by integrating the colors, I am helping to try and unify the piece together, right? Okay, so then getting to the shadows, I did them on two separate layers for this guy. So this was the first one, and this one I just kind of did a general all over shadow following where the light's coming from. So using the photo reference for this guy and for the city, it was actually basically the same general direction of the light source, which is that this side of the building is going to be darker. This side's going to be in shadow right here, if you guys can see my cursor. And then this side of the mask is also in shadow, right? The left side of both, okay? So when I'm doing this, the light's coming from the right up here, the top right corner. And it's daytime, so the light's pretty generally all over the place, but by giving us a general light direction of where the light source is coming from, it helps us create the three-dimensional shapes, the three-dimensional forms, I'm sorry. So sidetrack, but shapes are two-dimensional, forms are three-dimensional. And we're drawing shapes, but we're imagining them like they're forms, so just keep that in mind. If I say shapes, I really mean forms. And when we're drawing shapes, we want to think about them like they have volume. We want to think about them like you can fit things inside of them, right? So for this guy, let me turn off the color layers. Actually, let me turn off the background first so that that's out of our way. Okay, so now we're just focused on this guy. Let me make him a little bit bigger so you guys can see him a little better. Okay, so for this guy, let me turn off the colors so you can just see the shading. So this is just the first layer of shading. And like I said, I found the light source, which was coming from the top right, and I tried to follow it down. You can see there's a shadow here on the top right of the hand, but up on the fingers, they're in the light. So what's happening is the light's hitting the top of the fingers, but then it's not hitting the side of the hand as much. So the light's coming more from above and from the top. Sorry, from the top and from the side, right? So as his head comes down here, it's casting a shadow down onto the t-shirt a little bit. His hands are casting a shadow onto his face because they're blocking the light onto the side of his head here, down onto his cheeks. The sleeve is casting a shadow a little bit onto the arms here. And it's just a very general shading. It's not a very extreme lighting situation. But it does have a general source to it and does start having a three-dimensional form to it. And you guys just want to think about that as you're laying your own stuff out. Think about where the light's coming from. Think about what kind of light source it is, how strong of a light source it is. And then once you get a general, area of shading in like this, I went back in and I just added a second one just to help create a little bit more contrast and to help things pop a little bit more. So, especially in the t-shirt, because the shirt's so dark, I wasn't able to see the shading. So I thought a little bit more shading here would help it stand out a little bit more with the darker colors. And it's kind of working. I still feel like I might have to up the values on the t-shirt shading to get them to show up a little more, but I haven't done that yet. So right now everything's the same general shade. So the reason it looks like this is because I have my layer set to multiply, and it's a layer blending mode. Normally when you're, and for those of you guys that have never worked digitally before, I'm sorry, this isn't going to make a lot of sense, but when you're working on your different layers, you can set them, if you look over here, to normal. I'm on my sketch layer, that's why it says normal, but if I click up here on the shadow layer, it says multiply up here. So there's just a drop down menu. I gotta unlock the layer, and I can drop down, and there's all these different layer blending modes available to me. And multiply makes your darker colors darken a little bit, but it makes all of your whites transparent. So when you're doing your shading like this, these purples, when I add the flat colors back in, all overlap whatever the flat color is, and they create a new color by mixing the transparent purple color that I used for the shading with the color that's already there. So this same color, you can see when it's on the skin tone, it's this one shade of purple, versus when it's on the mask, it's more of a blue, right? And then on the t-shirt here, it's more of a dark brown. So it's, by putting it on multiply, it's a little bit transparent, and it's reading the color underneath and creating a new value. So if I change the colors here, like let me show you an example. So if I slide this around, sorry, my computer's running really slow, it's going to take a minute, but I can adjust the hue of the colors, meaning the color itself, and the shading adjusts for it. So take a look at one part of it, so either the skin tone or the mask, and just notice how when I move the color around, the shading adjusts. You're not getting the same tone. Like if you were to pick a unique color for the mask and a unique color for the skin tone, it wouldn't change as much if it was on a normal layer. But by having it on multiply like this, I'm able to drag the colors around, set new colors up, and the shading adjusts to it. So I could make multiple versions of this, use different colors. I could do a black and white version, I could do a colored version, I could do an inverse version where all the colors are opposite. I could do this purple and gold kind of color scheme that we have here, and all the shading is going to translate. So it's a really nice effect, and it's really easy to do. All you have to do is change the layer blending mode and just do your shading like normal. Okay, so let me go ahead and turn everything back on now so you guys can see the whole thing as is. Okay, so this is the piece I'm working on right now. I hope you guys like it. In future videos, I hope to go over some specific lessons, and I've got some topics in mind coming up for future videos. But in the meantime, if you guys want to leave a comment below with any links to your work, point me in the directions of a specific piece you'd like me to talk about, and I'll compile together all the pieces that I get, and I'll do like a group critique where I go through each one and I talk about what's working, what's not working, and try and give you guys some feedback so that as you're working at home, you can still be progressing and improving your skills. So if you guys like this video, please give it a like, leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and hopefully I'll be putting out more of these on a regular basis. If you guys have any topics you'd like to see me cover, leave it in a comment below so that I can take a look at that. And as I'm planning ahead, I'll try and cover as many things as you guys suggest. And in the meantime, if you guys have any questions, just let me know. But have fun drawing, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.